Welcome to the Occult Knowledge Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Carter, and in today's episode we journey into the hidden chambers of ancient Egypt. Not the ones lined with gold or inscribed for pharaohs, but those carved in silence, behind temple walls, where select initiates were trained in secret rites lost to time. What if the real power of Egypt wasn't in its monuments, but in forbidden knowledge passed mouth to ear, guarded for thousands of years? Beneath the blazing sun of ancient Kemet, along the winding banks of the Nile, rose a civilization whose spiritual architecture was as vast as its stone monuments. But the true heartbeat of ancient Egypt did not pulse on the surface. Hidden deep within the temples of Luxor, Karnak and Edfu existed chambers restricted to the priesthood, vaulted sanctuaries reserved for initiates of the mystery schools. These were not merely centers of worship, but training grounds for sacred knowledge believed to have originated from divine beings, knowledge far older than dynastic Egypt itself. Egyptian mythology spoke of a golden age when gods walked among men, a time ruled by the Neteru, divine intelligences like Thoth, Isis, Osiris, and Horus. Thoth, known as Jehuti, was said to have gifted humanity the arts of writing, astronomy, mathematics, and magic. It was he who, according to esoteric traditions, established the first mystery school, a school that taught not only the mechanics of the universe, but the hidden structure of the soul. Entry into these sacred orders was not guaranteed by blood or birthright. Initiation required a symbolic death of the old self. Candidates endured rigorous mental, emotional, and physical trials designed to test purity, courage, and the willingness to sacrifice ego for truth. They studied cosmology not as passive observers, but as active participants in a spiritual unfolding. Every symbol, every ritual, encoded metaphysical principles that mirrored the architecture of the cosmos and the internal mechanics of consciousness. The temples themselves were built as living books. Each hall, each pillar, each hieroglyph formed part of a curriculum meant to guide initiates through layers of understanding. Inscriptions told stories of gods and kings on the surface, but hidden beneath was a deeper language, a spiritual blueprint for transforming the self and communing with the divine. This wasn't religion in the modern sense. It was initiation into the mystery of being. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, more accurately called the Book of Coming Forth by Day, was not a funerary manual as commonly portrayed, but a symbolic map of the soul's journey through the underworld, an inner landscape mirroring the process of spiritual awakening. Initiates memorized and embodied these truths long before their physical deaths. To pass through the veils of illusion, one had to conquer fear, master desire, and awaken the divine spark within. This knowledge was guarded not out of elitism, but out of necessity. In the wrong hands, it could manipulate rather than liberate. It is said that initiates swore oaths of silence, knowing that to misuse or reveal these teachings prematurely would result not only in social exile, but in cosmic imbalance. They were stewards of a sacred legacy, a living current stretching back to a time before time. Yet even in its own day, this knowledge was hidden in plain sight. Encoded in mythology, masked in ritual, buried in stone, always present, yet always protected. Because the deeper one went into the mysteries, the more it became clear. True power lies not in domination, but in understanding. And understanding in the ancient Egyptian sense was not intellectual, it was initiatory. It had to be lived, died for, and reborn into. The modern understanding of Egypt's mystery schools is fragmented, obscured by the sands of time and the deliberate silence of those who once walked their inner corridors. But scattered across ancient texts, travelers' journals, and the whispered echoes of esoteric traditions, there remains evidence, clues pointing to a deliberate and calculated suppression. What survived the centuries was not the full body of knowledge, but fragments, torn pages from a much larger codex of human potential. In the early centuries of the Common Era, as the Roman Empire expanded and Christianity rose to dominance, temples once alive with ritual and sacred instruction were shuttered, repurposed, or destroyed. The great temple of Isis on Philae was among the last to fall silent. Its closure marked the end of a lineage stretching back thousands of years. Initiates who had preserved and practiced the mysteries in secret for generations faced a stark choice: assimilation, exile, or death. One of the most significant acts of suppression came with the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. While not strictly a temple of initiation, the library was a repository of esoteric knowledge from across the known world, much of it rooted in or influenced by the teachings of the Egyptian mystery schools. When the fires consumed its scrolls, the world lost not only history, but wisdom, insights into consciousness, energy, and metaphysical laws that had taken millennia to compile. Later, during the Inquisition and colonial eras, European powers targeted what remained of Egypt's hidden traditions. Early explorers, missionaries, and scholars systematically removed temple reliefs, statues, and texts, shipping them to private collections and museums, or destroying them outright. What couldn't be erased was often reinterpreted through a Western lens, stripped of its spiritual meaning and reduced to mere mythology or superstition. But the suppression was not only physical. It was ideological. In an age increasingly ruled by materialism and empirical science, the idea that ancient civilizations possessed advanced spiritual knowledge became taboo. The term mystery school itself was marginalized, relegated to the realm of fringe belief and pseudo-history. Academics mocked, clergy condemned, and governments ignored. There were those who attempted to preserve the lineage. Hermetic philosophers during the Renaissance claimed descent from Egyptian wisdom, though their writings were often veiled in allegory to avoid persecution. In more recent centuries, secret societies such as the Rosicrucians and Freemasons cited the Egyptian mysteries as foundational, though even these orders have seen their teachings diluted or distorted over time. Today, the few remaining records are incomplete. References in Greek and Coptic texts, fragments of temple inscriptions, encoded messages in alchemical treatises. The core teachings, the living practices, were never meant to be written. They were experiential, transmuted from teacher to student through silence, presence, and the initiatory ordeal. And so the true heart of Egypt's mystery schools vanished, not because it was forgotten, but because it was hidden, intentionally, carefully, for those who proved worthy to rediscover it. Clues to the deeper truths once taught within the Egyptian mystery schools can still be found, if one knows where to look. The surviving fragments hint at a system of knowledge that transcended religion or myth. It was not dogmatic but symbolic, not literal but experiential. Inscriptions within the temple walls of Dendera and Abydos depict cosmic processes alongside images of gods, yet those gods functioned less as deities in the modern sense and more as archetypes, personifications of natural forces and aspects of consciousness. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence is the so-called Dendera light, an image carved in the temple of Hathor. It appears to show figures holding a device resembling a modern light bulb, with serpents coiled inside a bulb-shaped enclosure connected to what looks like a power source. Mainstream scholars dismiss it as a stylized lotus flower with a symbolic serpent of life, but alternative researchers argue that it may represent advanced knowledge of energy manipulation, encoded in mythic form. Regardless of its literal interpretation, it reflects a deeper truth, that Egyptian symbolism operated on multiple levels, each layer revealing more to those who had been initiated. Similarly, the Ankh, commonly understood as a symbol of life, may have functioned as more than an icon. Some esoteric traditions assert it was used in rituals involving resonance and breath, tools for activating spiritual energy within the body. The Ankh appears frequently in the hands of gods and initiates, often directed toward the nose or mouth of the recipient, suggesting it may have been involved in practices of spiritual transference or awakening. Perhaps most compelling are the architectural alignments of the temples themselves. Structures like the Great Pyramid at Giza are precisely aligned to celestial bodies, constructed with mathematical precision that modern engineers still struggle to fully replicate. Scholars debate the purpose of the pyramid: tomb, monument, or something more. Some researchers propose that it functioned as an initiation chamber, where initiates would lie in the sarcophagus of the king's chamber, experiencing symbolic death, guided by the resonant acoustics of the granite walls and the subtle electromagnetic effects of the chamber's geometry. The goal was not physical death, but ego death, the rebirth of a new self attuned to divine wisdom. Texts like the Lament of Hermes from the Hermetic corpus speak of a time when the sacred temples would be defiled and Egypt's spiritual light extinguished. But even in lament there is prophecy, that one day the mysteries would be remembered, reawakened through those with eyes to see beyond the veil of illusion. Each piece of evidence, each symbol or architectural anomaly serves as a breadcrumb leading back to something profound. The teachings may have been erased from scrolls, but they remain imprinted in stone, myth and symbol, waiting not for casual observers, but for seekers capable of decoding a language written in silence, a language whose grammar is geometry, whose syntax is ritual, and whose meaning lies buried not in history books, but in consciousness itself. What sets the Egyptian mystery schools apart is not just their complexity, but their uncanny resemblance to esoteric traditions from other corners of the ancient world. Patterns begin to emerge, recurring motifs that surface in disparate civilizations with no direct contact. The serpent as a symbol of wisdom and transformation, the use of sacred geometry in temple design, the triadic structure of deity archetypes, the ritual journey of death and rebirth. These aren't isolated inventions. They suggest a shared origin, or at least a shared access to something deeper. In Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl mirrors Thoth in function and symbolism, both associated with wisdom, the calendar, and the transmission of divine knowledge. In India, Kundalini energy is described as a coiled serpent at the base of the spine, a force that rises through spiritual practice, strikingly similar to Egyptian depictions of serpents rising toward the forehead, aligning with the third eye. In both cultures, awakening this inner force is key to enlightenment. The Greek Eleusinian mysteries also echo Egyptian initiatory structure. Initiates of Eleusis underwent a secretive, multi-stage rite said to induce visions of life after death and the immortality of the soul. These rites trace directly back to Egyptian influence, carried into Greece through Pythagoras and later Plato, who both studied in Egypt. Plato's accounts of Atlantis, of the eternal soul, of ideal forms, all bear the imprint of Egyptian metaphysical thought. Architecturally, the similarities are just as striking. Across cultures, from Angkor Wat to Stonehenge, temples are aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and star constellations. The Great Pyramid's alignment with Orion's belt mirrors the myth of Osiris, the god of resurrection and cosmic order. The Dogon people of Mali possess advanced knowledge of the Sirius star system, knowledge they claim was handed down from beings linked to ancient Egypt. These patterns suggest more than cultural coincidence. They imply an encoded inheritance, deliberately dispersed, carefully preserved. Even the myth of a flood that wipes out a great civilization, only to leave behind survivors tasked with preserving sacred knowledge, appears globally. In Sumeria, it's the tale of Ziusudra. In India, Manu. In Mesoamerica, Coxcox. And in Egypt, the myth of the Zep Tepi, or first time, speaks of an age before the deluge when divine beings ruled in harmony and light. Why do these echoes persist across time and space? Were they remnants of a single prehistoric civilization now lost to history? Were they the result of parallel awakenings, a kind of spiritual resonance that arises when human consciousness matures to a certain point? Or were they deliberately seeded by initiates travelling across continents to plant the same cosmic truths under different names and symbols? Whatever the source, these patterns form a web of spiritual continuity, a language of signs whispering the same message in different tongues. They reveal that the Egyptian mystery schools were not isolated phenomena, but part of a global network of ancient wisdom traditions, each one a piece of a shattered mirror reflecting the same hidden light. The academic response to these connections has been at best dismissive, and at worst, openly hostile. The dominant narrative within archaeology and Egyptology paints the ancient Egyptians as brilliant for their time, yet constrained by primitive tools and myth-bound thinking. Any suggestion that their spiritual systems contain sophisticated metaphysical knowledge is typically waved away as romanticism or pseudoscience. The sacred becomes superstition, and initiation becomes ceremony devoid of meaning. Institutions have long drawn a hard line between myth and history, enforcing a rigid framework that leaves little room for anything that challenges established timelines or scientific orthodoxy. The mystery schools, by their very nature, threaten that framework. They point to the possibility that ancient peoples were not just early engineers or astronomers, but initiates of a deeper, non-material science. One that viewed consciousness not as a byproduct of the brain, but as the primary medium of reality. For modern academia steeped in materialism, this is heresy. Funding plays a significant role in maintaining the status quo. Research that hints at spiritual or metaphysical interpretations rarely receives institutional backing. Scholars who veer into esoteric territory often find their careers quietly sabotaged, grants denied, peer reviews delayed, reputations tarnished. The academic gatekeeping isn't always overt, but it is consistent. A professor who dares to question the conventional purpose of the pyramids, for instance, risks professional exile. Museums and universities tend to compartmentalize their discoveries. An artifact with strange properties or inexplicable symbolism is catalogued, labelled, and then displayed without interpretation. Stripped of context, its deeper meanings left unexplored. The public is fed a sanitized version of history, where temples are tourist sites, myths are bedtime stories, and spiritual practices are relegated to anthropology rather than serious philosophical inquiry. Even the language used to describe these traditions betrays a subtle bias. Terms like primitive, pre-scientific, and mythological reinforce the illusion that our ancestors were intellectually inferior. But the precision of their architecture, the complexity of their symbolism, and the enduring nature of their myths tell another story, one that academia seems unwilling to engage with. Part of the resistance lies in fear. Fear that acknowledging these ancient systems might require a complete revision of history, religion, and science. Fear that we are not the pinnacle of civilization, but inheritors of a broken legacy whose true origins remain hidden. If Egypt's mystery schools held truths about the soul, the cosmos, or even the nature of time and energy that modern science is only beginning to glimpse, then the institutions that shape our worldview are built on a partial understanding at best. And so the walls remain. Not the temple walls of Luxor or Karnak, those still stand in stone, but the academic walls of skepticism and control. Walls designed not to protect truth, but to contain it. To keep the sacred classified, and the initiatory buried beneath layers of scholarly denial. Beyond the guarded halls of academia and the ruins of stone temples, a different narrative persists, one carried by mystics, occultists, and fringe researchers who refuse to accept the official story. These are the voices that propose the unspoken possibilities, the theories deemed too radical or too dangerous for mainstream discourse. They speak of lost civilizations, ancient technologies, and knowledge systems that far surpass what we've been taught. And they all point back, again and again, to the mystery schools of Egypt as the origin point of something vast and unfinished. One of the most persistent theories suggests that the ancient Egyptians inherited their knowledge from an even older civilization, perhaps one destroyed by cataclysm. Whether this was Atlantis, Zep-Tepi, or a nameless precursor, the theory holds that survivors of a global event preserved fragments of a sacred science and seeded it throughout the ancient world. Egypt became a vault, a civilization tasked with safeguarding the remains of a deeper order of wisdom. Proponents of this idea often point to anomalies in Egypt's architectural timeline. The erosion patterns on the Sphinx, for instance, suggest water damage inconsistent with the arid climate of the last several thousand years. Some geologists argue the wear could date back to a time when the region experienced heavy rainfall, possibly as far back as 10,000 BCE. If true, it implies that the Sphinx and potentially the nearby pyramids predate dynastic Egypt by millennia. This alone would upend the foundation of our understanding and open the door to a forgotten chapter of human history. Other fringe researchers delve into consciousness science, suggesting that the mystery schools possessed techniques to alter perception, time, and even physical reality. They theorize that ancient rituals weren't just symbolic, they were functional. Practices involving sound resonance, sacred geometry, breathwork, and ecstatic states may have opened pathways into altered states of awareness, giving initiates access to non-local knowledge. In this view, temples were not just places of worship, They were technological instruments designed to facilitate contact with higher dimensions or intelligences. Still others suggest extraterrestrial influence, citing ancient depictions of strange beings, star maps, and myths of sky gods descending from the heavens. While often sensationalized, these accounts persist across cultures. In Egypt, the god Thoth is sometimes associated with beings of advanced knowledge who arrived from the stars to elevate humanity. Whether literal or symbolic, these stories hint at a transmission of knowledge from sources far beyond ordinary human experience. To many, these ideas sound absurd, but the vehemence with which they are rejected often mirrors the magnitude of what they imply. If even one thread holds, if the mystery schools truly accessed a system of consciousness technology or preserved knowledge from a forgotten epoch, then the implications are staggering. It would mean our species is not progressing toward knowledge, but rather recovering from amnesia. That buried beneath centuries of dogma and denial is a truth so disruptive, it must remain forbidden. Not because it is false, but because it changes everything. The consistent disappearance of this knowledge across civilizations raises a question that can no longer be ignored. Was the erasure of the Egyptian mystery schools part of a larger, deliberate pattern? The fall of temples, the burning of scrolls, the repurposing of sacred sites into mundane buildings, these were not random acts of time. They were acts of control, carried out across eras by forces that recognized the power of hidden knowledge and feared what it could awaken in the human mind. Throughout history, the same institutions that claimed moral or spiritual authority also played key roles in the systematic suppression of esoteric traditions. In Egypt, the Greek and later Roman occupations ushered in a new era of philosophical skepticism and political consolidation. The mystery schools, once guarded by temple priests and hierophants, were seen as threats to the order of empire. Their teachings emphasized individual transformation, divine selfhood and inner sovereignty, concepts fundamentally at odds with centralized rule and religious obedience. When Christianity became the dominant force in Egypt and across the Roman Empire, the spiritual landscape was forcibly restructured. Pagan temples were closed or converted. Sacred rites were banned or demonized. Knowledge once revered as divine became rebranded as heresy. Isis, once the embodiment of divine motherhood and wisdom, was erased to make room for Mary. Thoth, the keeper of cosmic law and higher knowledge, vanished into oblivion. The temples of initiation were repurposed and their spiritual blueprints scattered. Later, during the Islamic conquests and the subsequent European colonial period, further layers of erasure were added. The Arab invaders renamed cities and suppressed non-Islamic spiritual practices. European powers obsessed with conquest and classification reduced Egypt to a land of tombs and treasure, extracting artifacts while ignoring their deeper meanings. Museums filled with sacred objects stripped of context became the new tombs, places where knowledge was entombed behind glass. In secret, however, fragments survived. Oral traditions kept by initiates, coded messages in alchemical texts, echoes in Masonic rituals. But the original system, the full spiritual technology of transformation, was broken apart like a shattered mirror. What remained were pieces, separated and scattered, without the original instructions to bind them together. And yet, the same archetypes return. The same knowledge, buried in one age, re-emerges in another, under different names, in different robes, speaking a language adapted to its time. But always at risk. Because this knowledge does more than explain reality, it empowers those who understand it. It teaches them how to awaken, how to access deeper layers of self, how to resist systems built on ignorance and fear. And for those in power, that kind of awakening is dangerous. So the pattern repeats: revelation, suppression, rebirth. Empires rise and fall, but the occult current endures, carried not in institutions but in symbols, not in texts but in memory, hidden not by accident but by design. Because what the Egyptian mystery schools preserved was not just a path to truth, it was a path to liberation. And liberation, in the eyes of those who rule by control, must never be allowed to flourish unchecked. If even fragments of the Egyptian mystery school teachings are authentic, the implications stretch far beyond historical curiosity. They challenge the foundation of how we understand not just the past, but the very nature of human potential. These teachings did not merely explain the mechanics of stars, gods, or death. They provided a map of consciousness itself. They described the human being not as a helpless creation of matter, but as a layered vessel capable of transformation, ascension, and direct communion with the divine. At the heart of the mystery schools was the idea that humanity had forgotten its origin, that we are not merely bodies with souls, but souls temporarily clothed in flesh, beings undergoing a process of spiritual refinement. Every symbol, every myth, every rite was constructed to remind initiates of that forgotten truth. The veil between the physical and spiritual was not permanent. It could be pierced, and behind it lay the knowledge of who we truly are. The rituals of initiation were more than ceremonial. They mirrored stages of inner awakening. The descent into darkness symbolized the death of the ego. The journey through hidden chambers represented the soul's confrontation with illusion. The emergence into light was not simply theatrical. It was meant to reflect a real change in perception, an irreversible shift in awareness. These were processes that trained the initiate to see through the veil of the world, not with belief, but with direct experience. If such a process was once known and practiced, then its disappearance marks not progress, but a form of collective amnesia. Modern society has replaced the mystery school with systems of control. Mass media instead of myth, pharmaceuticals instead of ritual, data instead of wisdom. We are told to look outward for solutions, never inward. Our education teaches facts, but not understanding. Our religions offer dogma, but not transformation. Our science maps the physical, but denies the spiritual. The knowledge once held in the temples of Egypt was not meant to be worshipped. It was meant to be lived. It offered a framework where divinity was not external, but internal. The gods were not distant overlords, but symbolic aspects of the self to be integrated. Isis was the intuition, Osiris the higher mind, Horus the awakened consciousness born from their union. To understand these figures not as myths, but as metaphors for inner alchemy, is to grasp the power of the teachings, and the threat they pose to any system built on hierarchy, fear, or ignorance. If these teachings were ever fully recovered and practiced widely, it could redefine what it means to be human. It would suggest that our true purpose is not to dominate the world, but to remember our place within it, not to seek salvation from above, but to awaken the divine spark already burning within. It would dissolve the illusions of separation between body and soul, between man and God, between self and cosmos. And that is the most radical idea of all, that the greatest mystery is not buried in the sands of Egypt, but sleeping within us, waiting not to be taught, but to be remembered. If the legacy of the Egyptian mystery schools has survived in any form, it is not in the texts or artifacts hoarded in museums. It lives in the echoes, symbols that continue to speak, myths that refuse to die, and an unshakable human intuition that something essential was lost, something profound, something sacred. Across time and culture, seekers have felt the pull toward a hidden truth, a sense that beneath the noise of modern life, there is an older voice calling from the depths. It does not speak in words. It speaks in symbols, in dreams, in the quiet space between thoughts. The initiates of ancient Egypt understood that truth could not be forced into language. It had to be embodied, lived, and experienced through trial. It had to break you open. It had to be earned. In a world that glorifies speed, distraction, and control, their teachings stand in stark opposition. They demand stillness, surrender, the courage to walk into darkness and emerge not with answers, but with a new way of seeing. And perhaps that's why the mystery schools had to be hidden. Not because their knowledge was dangerous in the way we imagine, mechanical, weaponized, destructive, but because it was liberating. It threatened all systems of external authority by placing the highest power within. If the soul is sovereign, then no king, priest, or scientist holds dominion over it. If awakening is possible without temples, laws, or intermediaries, then control becomes impossible. And so, over centuries, the map to that inner temple was buried, not destroyed, but scattered across time, awaiting those who would piece it back together. The temples lie in ruins, but their geometry still hums. The symbols are worn, but they still speak. The rites are forgotten, but the path remains. It runs through the core of every human being, carved into the structure of consciousness itself. Those who seek it do not need a passport or a priesthood. They need only the willingness to look within, to walk where others fear to tread, and to trust that beyond the illusions of this world lies a deeper order, a sacred pattern, an eternal truth. What was once reserved for the few now whispers to the many, and though the gatekeepers still stand, the gates are beginning to crack. The light that once filled the inner sanctums of Egypt has not gone out. It waits, beneath the surface of history, beneath the noise of the world, beneath the masks we wear, not in stone, but in soul. Thanks for listening. This has been another episode of the Occult Knowledge Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to support the show, subscribe to the Forbidden Knowledge Network on Patreon. Subscribe now.